Welcome to our deep dive today, where we're going to be looking into time, its value, and really how it impacts our lives. We're going to be working with an excerpt from an academic article called The Value of Time: Perception, Utilization, and Societal Impact. And we're going to really kind of dig in and pull out some of the most fascinating points.
Yeah, I think one of the things you'll find really interesting is that time is perceived so differently across different cultures. It's almost like different realities.
It really is it's kind of mind-blowing to think about how different cultures view time. Like, for example, did you know that the Kachin people of Burma, they don't even have a single word for time?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? They use different words to refer to things like clock time, the seasons, or even a person's lifespan. So that kind of suggests like a completely different way of understanding time than what we're used to, especially in like Western cultures.
Right, and it makes you wonder how that shapes their daily lives, their sense of urgency, or even how they plan for the future.
Definitely something to think about, yeah. And especially when you contrast that with cultures that place a huge value on productivity and efficiency, like those that are influenced by the Protestant work ethic.
Right, yeah, it's almost like time is seen as a commodity to be maximized.
Exactly, yeah, and that leads to a very different way of approaching things like work, leisure, and even social interactions.
So, we've talked about how societies view time, but would you say that the way a society measures and organizes time also reflects those cultural values?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, think about the ancient Mayans with their very intricate system of multiple calendars used for different purposes, or how about the Roman calendar, which counted the years from the founding of Rome? I mean, these aren't just arbitrary systems. They reflect these deep beliefs about time and its significance.
Right. Okay. So we've touched on how different cultures perceive time, but what about how our own psychology influences our experience of time?
Well, it definitely does, yeah. Our brains aren't just relying on clocks and calendars. Our perception of time is constantly being shaped by things like our emotions, our attention, and even our memories.
So like when you're reading a good book and like hours have gone by and you didn't even notice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or think about how time seems to drag on forever when you're bored or like anxiously waiting for something. So yeah, our emotional state plays a big role in how we experience that passage of time.
It's almost like our emotions are warping time. Is there a term for that? Something like time distortion?
Yeah, time distortion is a real thing, and it can be really powerful. And in fact, researchers have even linked it to some mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
Wow, that's pretty intense. Are there ways that we can kind of intentionally influence our perception of time, maybe in a more positive way?
Well, there's some really interesting research that's coming out now about the connection between time perception and the motor cortex. And it suggests that physical activity might actually change our subjective experience of time.
So if I hit the gym, time might feel slower. That would be a great bonus.
Well, it's not quite that straightforward, but the research is really fascinating, and it really highlights that complex interplay between our physical bodies and how we perceive time.
That's so interesting. It seems like our brains have a lot more control over our experience of time than we might realize.
They really do. And there are also some psychological approaches like cultivating what's called a balanced time perspective.
Okay, so break that down for me. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's about kind of integrating our past, present, and future orientations in a healthy way, not dwelling too much on past regrets or getting overly anxious about the future, but really kind of finding a way to be present in the moment while still acknowledging that flow of time.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between appreciating the past, living in the present, and planning for the future without getting stuck in any one of those time frames.
Exactly. Yeah, and finding that balance can really be a key aspect of well-being because it allows us to experience time in a much more rich and fulfilling way.
So we've talked about how different cultures view time and even how our own minds can kind of influence our perception of it. But what about this concept of time itself? Like, has our understanding of it changed over time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Our understanding of time has evolved so much throughout history.
Yeah.
Early philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they really grappled with like the very nature of time. Plato famously described it as a moving likeness of eternity, while Aristotle saw it as a measure of like change and motion.
Those are some pretty profound ideas for their time, but I mean, it seems like a pretty straightforward concept, right? Like time just marches on, always moving forward.
Yeah, that was definitely like the prevailing view for centuries, especially with the rise of Newtonian physics. Isaac Newton, he proposed this idea of absolute time, like a universal constant that's just ticking away uniformly throughout the universe.
Right, which makes sense. It's kind of how we experience it in our everyday lives.
Right, but then along came Einstein with his theory of relativity, which totally like blew up our understanding of time. He showed that time is not absolute. It's relative to the observer's frame of reference. He linked time to space and gravity, kind of weaving them together into this crazy fabric that we call space-time.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me a little bit because relativity is one of those concepts that always makes my head spin.
Sure. So imagine you have two clocks, one here on Earth and one on a spaceship that's traveling at like super high speeds, according to Einstein. The clock on the spaceship would actually tick slower than the one on Earth. And the faster the spaceship travels, the more pronounced this difference in time becomes.
So time is literally moving at different speeds depending on where you are and how fast you're moving.
Exactly, yeah. That's a pretty wild concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
But it basically means that our experience of time is subjective, and it's influenced by all these factors that we never even considered before.
So much for time being a simple, straightforward concept. But, this kind of brings up an interesting question. If our perception of time is so subjective and kind of malleable, does that mean we can learn to manage it more effectively?
Yeah, I think that's where the link between understanding time and managing time is so important. When we start to see those time traps like procrastination, multitasking, distractions, that kind of stuff, we can actually start to develop strategies to combat them.
So it's about becoming aware of our own personal time wasters and then figuring out ways to kind of counteract them.
Exactly. It's like becoming a detective of your own time, uncovering those hidden patterns and habits that are robbing you of your precious hours.
And once we've kind of identified those culprits, we can start putting those classic time management techniques to work, like setting priorities, creating schedules, all that good stuff.
Exactly. But it's not about becoming like a slave to a rigid schedule. The goal is to find a system that works for you, something that helps you feel more in control of your time rather than feeling controlled by it.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. But even with the best intentions and the most effective strategies, sometimes it feels like there just isn't enough time to do everything we want or need to do.
Yeah, that feeling of time poverty is so real in today's world. We're constantly bombarded with information and demands and expectations. It's no wonder that we often feel rushed and overwhelmed.
It's like we're always trying to squeeze more and more into less and less time.
Exactly, and that can have some serious consequences. Chronic time pressure can lead to stress, burnout, and even a decline in physical health. It can also strain our relationships and just make it really hard to fully engage in the things that matter most to us.
So it's like this vicious cycle. The more time-pressed we feel, the more stressed and inefficient we become, which only makes that feeling of time scarcity even worse.
Exactly, and this cycle is often perpetuated by societal pressures and inequalities, too.
Yeah.
Think about like the unequal distribution of care work, which often falls disproportionately on women, limiting their time for other things, or the demands of like low-wage jobs that can leave people with very little time for anything else.
It's kind of heartbreaking to think about how these systemic issues are contributing to that time poverty for so many people.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that our individual relationship with time is really intertwined with all these larger social and economic forces. And it highlights the importance of advocating for policies and practices that promote greater equality and work-life balance.
So what can we do as individuals to kind of push back against this feeling of constant time scarcity?
I think it starts by recognizing that even though time is a finite resource, it's also a renewable one. We can make choices that help us replenish our reserves and cultivate that sense of time affluence, even amidst, the chaos of modern life.
So it's about shifting our mindset from scarcity to abundance, from feeling like we never have enough time to believing that we can make time for the things that truly matter.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming our time and using it intentionally to create a life that feels rich and fulfilled and fulfilling.
That's such a powerful concept. I think it really speaks to the importance of recognizing the value of time, not just as a commodity to be like maximized, but as a gift to be cherished and used wisely.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Time is both a precious resource and this profound mystery.
Yeah.
It's something we can measure with clocks and calendars, but it's also something we experience in such a personal and subjective way.
It sounds like finding that balance between like the objective and subjective aspects of time is kind of key to living a truly fulfilling life.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, our exploration of time is far from over now. There are still so many fascinating aspects to uncover.
It's interesting because when we talk about time management, a lot of times people focus on productivity and efficiency, but we don't often talk about this idea of time affluence, like you mentioned.
Yeah, it is an important difference, right? Time affluence isn't just about having free time. It's more about that feeling of having enough time.
Right.
Enough time to enjoy experiences, to do things that are meaningful, and just be present without that constant feeling of being rushed.
Yeah, and I think we've all felt those moments of time affluence, like when you're totally absorbed in something you love and time just seems to disappear. It's such a great feeling.
It really is. And what's really interesting is that research suggests that feeling of time affluence is actually linked to better decision making.
Oh, really? I wouldn't have guessed that. Why do you think that is?
Well, when we feel like we have enough time, we're less likely to make those impulsive choices, based on scarcity or fear.
Right.
We have the mental space to really think things through, consider those long-term consequences, and make choices that line up with our values and goals.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having that breathing room to think without that pressure to make a quick decision.
Exactly. Time affluence allows us to use our wisdom and make choices that are more likely to lead to well-being and fulfillment.
So it's not just about feeling good in the moment, it's also about setting ourselves up for success down the road.
Exactly. It really highlights how important our relationship with time is to our overall well-being. It's not just a tool to get things done, it's a fundamental part of how we experience and create our lives.
And this all kind of ties back to that idea of planning, doesn't it? Not in a controlling way, but in a way that helps us be more intentional with our time and create space for the things that matter most.
Absolutely. Planning isn't about getting rid of spontaneity. It's about making conscious choices about how we spend our time.
Yeah.
It's about making a framework that supports our values and helps us live a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling.
So it's about designing our lives in a way that supports what's important to us and allows us to have those moments of time affluence more often.
Exactly. It's about taking back control of our time instead of letting it control us. And this brings us to a really crucial point that I think sometimes gets overlooked, and that's the importance of really valuing time with our loved ones.
Yeah, it's easy to get so caught up in the day-to-day that we forget to make time for those people we care about most. We put off phone calls, we postpone visits, we tell ourselves we'll have more time later.
Yeah, and the problem is that later often never comes. We fall into this trap of taking time for granted, assuming it will always be there. But the reality is our time is limited. We just don't know how much we have.
That's a good point, and it's a good reminder to be present in the moment. Savor those moments with the people we love and create memories that will last.
Yeah, it's not just about those big gestures or fancy vacations. It's about those everyday moments of connection, like sharing a meal, having a good conversation, just being present with each other.
Right, those are the moments that really make up the fabric of our lives, the things that connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And research shows that those strong social connections are so good for us. They can lead to more happiness, better health, and even a longer life.
So investing in our relationships isn't just a nice thing to do, it's actually crucial for our well-being.
Absolutely. Nurturing those bonds is one of the most valuable things we can do with our time. It's about making those human connections that make life so rich and meaningful a priority.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into time, what are some key things you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that time is a really precious resource. It's something to cherish and use wisely. It's about seeing the value of time not just as something to maximize, but as a gift that lets us experience life to the fullest.
And it's also about understanding that our perception of time is subjective. It's shaped by our culture, our emotions, our experiences, and we have more control over how we experience time than we often think.
Exactly. And that control allows us to cultivate time affluence even when life gets busy. It's about choosing how we spend our time, setting boundaries, and putting those things that really matter first.
And in the end, how we spend our time really shows what's important to us and what we find meaningful in life.
I love that it's about aligning what we do with what we value and creating a life that feels both purposeful and fulfilling.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to be more mindful with my time, to enjoy those moments of connection, and to really embrace that feeling of time affluence.
Me too. And I hope our listeners are feeling the same way.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploring all the different aspects of time. It's been a really insightful conversation.
It has been. And remember, time is a gift, and how we choose to open it is up to us.
Until next time.
This is DigitView.